I held the two banknotes side by side and felt something colder than fear. Same denomination, same paper, same ink, same portrait, same serial number. They were identical in every way two notes should never be. But I did not panic, not yet. What I felt first was something dangerously close to pride, because these were not counterfeits. They were real, perfectly real. And that was the most beautiful part of it. I had not broken the system. I had understood it better than the men paid to protect it. If something this impossible could exist in plain sight, then maybe the flaw was never me. Maybe the flaw was always hidden inside the word legal. I learned the shape of humiliation before I was old enough to name it. My father had once been a man people greeted with respect. He owned a business. He stood straight. He spoke like someone who believed tomorrow still belonged to him. Then the debts came, and with them, the men who carried papers. I still remember the way they entered our house. Not angry, not loud. That would have been easier to forgive. They were calm, efficient, almost bored. They placed documents on the table and spoke to my father as if he had already been reduced to something administrative, something finished. They never raised their voices. They did not need to. The papers did all the humiliating for them, and that was the moment I understood something ugly about the world. A man does not become worthless when he loses money. He becomes worthless when the system decides his name no longer carries weight. That was the wound, not poverty, shame. I did not grow up thinking wealth was the highest form of power. I grew up believing legitimacy was. The signature, the seal, the document, those were the real weapons. Because I had seen what happened to a man when the world stopped recognizing him on paper. And I made myself a quiet promise then, long before I had the words for it. That would never be me. By the time I was old enough to build a future, I'd already stopped believing merit would be enough. The world said it rewarded competence. What it actually rewarded was documentation. Not what you could do, what you could prove, or better yet, what you could make other people believe had already been proved. So when I needed credentials I did not have, I created them. A diploma, a title, a version of myself the system would open its doors to. And the strange thing is, I did not experience that moment as corruption. I experienced it as translation. I knew I was capable. I knew I could work, build, manage, solve problems faster than half the men whose authority came pre-stamped and pre-approved. So if the gatekeepers demanded paper before they would look at the man standing in front of them, then paper was what I gave them. That was the first truly dangerous thought. Not that I could lie, but that I could lie my way into a role and then perform it well enough to make the lie feel justified. Because once the false document leads to real success, something inside you shifts. You stop feeling like an imposter. You start feeling like the only honest man in a dishonest system. And that belief, more than greed, more than ambition, is what makes a man difficult to stop. Angola taught me the lesson completely. Out there, far from Lisbon, I watched entire decisions move through government offices without anyone ever touching the truth beneath them. A report could be weak, a claim could be inflated, a project could exist more confidently on paper than it did in the ground. And still, if the file carried the right language, the right sequence, the right stamps, it moved. That was the revelation. The machine did not run on truth. It ran on form. A document with enough authority around it became stronger than reality. A signature in the right place mattered more than whether the road was finished. A seal pressed into paper mattered more than whether anyone had truly verified what lay underneath it. Most people would hear that and feel disgust. I felt clarity, because once you see that system for what it is, you cannot unsee it. You realize power is not held by the wisest men or even the most competent ones. It is held by the men who know how to make a lie pass through official hands without triggering discomfort. That knowledge changed me. Not all at once. Nothing so dramatic. It changed me slowly, the way poison works. One stamped file at a time, one approved fiction at a time, and somewhere in those years, I stopped asking whether something was true. I started asking a far more dangerous question. Would it survive inspection? When my earlier scheme collapsed and they finally put me in a cell, people assumed the story had corrected itself. That is what prison means to most men. Punishment, interruption, a hard stop. But a cell can do more than confine a man. It can concentrate him. I did not spend those months drowning in remorse. I did not pace the floor wondering where my life had gone wrong. That would make for a cleaner story, wouldn't it? A man sees the bars, finds his conscience, and emerges humbled. But humiliation had already done its work on me years before. Prison did not introduce me to shame. It removed distraction. For the first time in years, I had silence. And in that silence, my mind became sharper, not softer. I began reading everything I could get my hands on: banking statutes, financial procedures, institutional structures, and the mechanics behind authority itself. I was no longer looking for a trick. Tricks were small, temporary, vulnerable to timing, luck, miscalculation. I wanted something deeper than that. A weakness so embedded in the structure that the people inside it could no longer see it. That is what prison gave me. Scale. It took the restless ambition that had once chased opportunities and turned it into something colder. More patient, more architectural. I stopped thinking like a swindler hunting a gap in movement. I started thinking like a surgeon studying where the body was thinnest. By the time the cell door opened, I was not less dangerous. I was simply more precise. In prison, I spent enough time with the Bank of Portugal to understand something that should have unsettled me more than it did. The bank did not truly control the creation of its own money. It authorized it, yes. It approved it. It sanctified it with signatures and procedure and official language. But the physical act itself, the paper, the ink, the plates, the production lived elsewhere, in London, in the hands of a British printer. I read that detail once, then again, then a third time, because I could feel something opening. There it was, the distance between authority and execution, between the institution that gave permission and the machine that obeyed it. A gap bridged entirely by documents, and documents were a language I had already spent years learning to speak better than most honest men ever would. As that was the moment the shape of it appeared to me. Not the full plan, not yet. Just the outline of an impossible idea beginning to breathe. If a nation's money could come into existence because one office produced the right paper for another office to trust, then value itself was less solid than people imagined. It did not rest on gold, or labor, or morality. It rested on process, on deference, on whether the next man in the chain felt enough comfort to keep passing the file forward. That realization should have horrified me. Instead, it felt intimate, familiar, almost inevitable. Because I had seen this pattern before in ministries, in colonial offices, in stamped approvals that carried more weight than reality ever did. The system was not built to verify truth. It was built to preserve confidence, and confidence, I realized, could be manufactured. Once I saw the gap, the moral question should have come next. It did not. What came next was justification. Clean, elegant, almost noble justification. I told myself Portugal was already failing. The Republic was unstable, the currency was weak, the colonies were starving for investment, and the men supposedly in charge of fixing any of it were too timid, too slow, or too compromised to act. If the machinery of the state had frozen, then what exactly was I stealing from it? Paralysis? delay, neglect. That is how a man like me avoids seeing his own reflection clearly. He does not begin by calling himself innocent. He begins by calling the world worse. I convinced myself I was not preparing a fraud. I was preparing a correction, a forced intervention, a private act of will inside a public system too exhausted to save itself. And because part of that was true, the lie settled comfortably inside me. That is what makes self-deception so powerful. It does not need to be pure fiction. It only needs enough truth to anesthetize conscience. So I stopped thinking in the language of crime. I thought in the language of necessity. Documents, intermediaries, seals, diplomatic channels, these were no longer tools of deception in my mind. They were instruments of execution, means to release capital where history, cowardice, and bureaucracy had locked it away. I was not taking money, I told myself. I was freeing it. And once a man starts believing that, he can walk toward almost anything without feeling the weight of sin. The first time I held the notes in my hands, I expected excitement, greed, maybe, relief, some crude thrill at having turned an impossible thought into reality. What I felt instead was something far more dangerous. Authority. The paper was flawless. The ink was flawless. The plates were the real plates. Everything about the notes told the same story. These belonged to the nation that issued them, and that was the beauty of it. I had not created an imitation. I had reached inside the machinery itself and made it produce on my behalf. That changes a man. Because money is never just money once you understand what it really is. It is permission. Movement, obedience in paper form, a thing strangers agree to trust because they believe someone above them has already sanctified it. And now I was holding that trust in bundles, not stolen trust, manufactured trust, authorized in every physical sense that mattered. In that moment, I did not feel like a criminal standing outside the gates. I felt like someone who had finally stepped behind the curtain and seen how cheaply the sacred could be assembled. That is when the plan stopped being abstract. Before, it had been intelligence, design, precision. Now it became intoxication. Because once you realize you can participate in the creation of value itself, ordinary ambition starts to feel childish. A salary is childish. A loan is childish. Even wealth begins to feel secondary. What seduced me was something much darker than money. It was the feeling that I had touched the hidden lever beneath reality. And it moved. Once the money began moving through the bank, the world responded exactly the way I had hoped it would. Not with suspicion, with gratitude. Loans appeared where none had existed before. Credit loosened, doors opened. Men who had spent years being told no suddenly heard yes. And because people are quick to worship whatever relieves their desperation, they began to look at me not as a fraud, but as a visionary. That was the most seductive part of all. Not the luxury, not the power, the applause. Because praise has a way of laundering a man's conscience. The more good I appeared to do, the easier it became to believe the means no longer mattered. If families could borrow, if businesses could breathe, if Angola could finally receive the development the state had starved it of for years, then what exactly was I supposed to regret? That I had succeeded where legitimate men had failed? I told myself history would understand me better than the law ever could. That is another dangerous thought, maybe the most dangerous one. Because once a man begins to imagine himself as necessary, he stops feeling bound by the rules written for ordinary people. He no longer sees restraint as morality, he sees it as weakness, delay, cowardice dressed up as principle. And with every compliment, every headline, every grateful handshake, the story inside my head grew stronger. I was not deceiving the country. I was revealing how badly it needed someone like me. By then, I was no longer merely protecting the lie. I was living inside it. But money was never the destination. That is what most people would never understand. If all I had wanted was comfort, I already had more than enough. Houses, influence, admiration, access, those are the trophies ordinary ambition chases. But ordinary ambition had stopped interesting me the moment I realized where real power lived, not in possessing wealth, in defining it. That is why I began buying shares in the Bank of Portugal, quietly, methodically, through intermediaries, not as an investor, but as a man moving toward the altar of legitimacy itself. Because if I could control the institution that gave money its official blessing, then everything would change. The notes would no longer be a trespass. They would become an irregularity, a clerical inconvenience, something to be absorbed, renamed. I folded back into the dignity of procedure. That was the final seduction. Not escape, but transformation. I did not want to outrun the system. I wanted to become the part of it that decides what is real. And beneath that ambition was the same wound that had been driving me since childhood. I was still chasing the thing my father lost in that room years ago. Not cash, standing, recognition, the invisible shield that keeps men from being reduced by paper. If I could own the bank, then no document could ever be used against me again. I would be the one behind the document, the one behind the seal, the one behind the lie everyone agreed to call truth. In the end, the system did not defeat me with brilliance. It defeated me with contact. 2 notes met in the same room, that was all. 2 perfectly real notes carrying the same serial number, crossing paths under the eyes of a man careful enough to notice what no one else had bothered to check for months. That is the cruelty of collapse. It does not always arrive as a grand unraveling. Sometimes it begins with a tiny moment of friction between your design and the ordinary randomness of the world. I had spent so long studying institutions, procedures, signatures, and habits of trust that I forgot something almost embarrassing in its simplicity. Reality does not need to understand your scheme to destroy it. It only needs to touch it in the wrong place. And the moment those 2 notes faced each other, and I felt something I had refused to feel from the beginning. Not guilt, not even fear at first. Recognition. The recognition that all my precision, all my intelligence, all my beautiful understanding of the system had never made me omnipotent. It had only made me arrogant enough to believe I could choreograph chance itself. That was the illusion breaking, not the plan. Me. When they finally came for me, the deepest wound was not the loss of money, it was the loss of proximity. I had come so close to the center of authority that I could already feel its warmth, close enough to believe that one more step, a few more shares, a little more time, and the distinction between fraud and legitimacy would disappear beneath my feet. That was the real tragedy. Not that I had failed to make money, that I had failed to cross over. Because in the end, my intelligence was not the thing I lacked. My nerve was not the thing I lacked. What I lacked was permission, the right kind of name, the right kind of office, the right to stamp my will onto paper and have the world call it lawful. So no, I did not feel like a thief being dragged away. I felt like an outsider being reminded, with brutal precision, that there is a difference between understanding power and being allowed to wear its face. In the end, I did not prove money was sacred, I proved it was fragile. Paper, ink, signatures, trust nothing more. The only real difference between my notes and theirs was never authenticity, it was authority. I was not punished for creating value out of paper. Every nation does that. I was punished because I was not the one officially allowed to decide when a fiction becomes reality.